Hello, it's Vicar Ezekiel Grabau, and today is Passion Sunday, the beginning of Holy Week. And it's very appropriate, the stanza that we're taking a look at today, because we find ourselves moving away from the triumphal entry and into Jesus' passion. Let's listen to that stanza. So we have here in the first half of this stanza a transition, as I said here at the beginning. What fading flowers his road adorn, the palms how soon laid down. No bloom or leaf, but only thorn, the King of Glory's crown. So we're looking at the triumphal entry, seeing all of the palm branches laid down and how soon all of that glory goes away. It's dealing with that same bit of irony that we talked about with our last stanza at the beginning, how the people don't realize how quickly things will change, how Jesus is being received as a celebrity, but soon he will be treated as a criminal and led to his death. And Timothy Dudley Smith does a really good job of using this plant matter as this transition, because we see the palms laid down, the flowers fading, and then this transition from the palms to the thorns. It's a really, really clever poetic connection. But it is a little strange that he mentions flowers, because that's not really mentioned in the gospel description of Jesus' triumphal entry. But it is mentioned in Isaiah. This sort of language is used to describe human nature. Let me read to you from Isaiah chapter 40, starting at verse 6. A voice says, "Cry." And I said, "What shall I cry? All flesh is grass, and all its beauty is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades when the breath of the Lord blows on it. Surely the people are grass." So we hear here a description of our own nature, that we don't last, that we change. Perhaps to use the language of a familiar hymn, change and decay in all around I see. And we should include ourselves in that we are full of change and decay and death. And here the change is from receiving Jesus as a king to receiving him as a criminal. And now his reception is not with a crown of laurels, that bloom or leaf. So a crown of laurels would be worn by a champion, one who'd won perhaps at the Olympic Games in Greece. And so it's a symbol of triumph, of having won the battle. But instead of a triumphant crown, Jesus receives a crown of thorns. But this crown is an appropriate crown for the King of Glory, since his glory is found in weakness and in suffering. And so it is an appropriate thing for him to wear. And especially appropriate when we consider the story of Abraham and Isaac, how the lamb for the sacrifice provided in place of Isaac is a ram with its horns caught in a thicket. And we have this image of the thorns encircling Jesus' brow, even as that ram, which was given in the place of the son, is sacrificed. And so he's sacrificed in our place as well. But we continue on. The soldiers mock, the rabble cries. The streets with tumult ring. as Pilate to the mob replies, "Behold, behold your king." The images that we have seen played out for us in stanzas 1 and 2 now come back to us, but warped and skewed. The soldiers that were absent in stanza 1 are now present, but not to parade and receive Jesus as king, but to mock him, to make fun of him, to clothe him in purple, put a crown of thorns upon his head, and beat him, pretending to pay homage to him. And instead of a crowd crying out Hosanna, looking to him and hoping for salvation, we now have a rabble that cries out, "Crucify him." The streets no longer ring with cries of Hosanna, but outcries for the death of Jesus. It's a mob instead of a crowd of Jesus' disciples. And now we have this turn where "Behold, behold your king" is now the words that Pilate says. And in fact, this is what Pilate says in John. It's recorded that Pilate brings forth Jesus and declares, "Behold your king." And the people say, "Away with this man," and demand that he be killed. And so this is probably the height of the moment of irony, because Pilate is sort of presenting Jesus. There's something almost mocking about the way that Pilate does it. He doesn't necessarily believe that Jesus is the proper king of the Jews, but he's making a point at the Jews. And the Jews deny him as their king, even though he properly is. He is the King of glory, and yet he is being rejected. And so it's this point here that we have the height of this sort of tragic irony, an irony that we've seen in other places, we talked about with our last stanza, but has an especially potent ring here because we've had this repeated note where we've heard this sort of martial beat that has encouraged us to see Jesus as he really is, but now we see it all turning and warping against him. Even the words, "Behold, behold your king," which the very stones would cry out, is now being thrown in Jesus' face and rejected by the people who should have received him. But it is in this very suffering that Jesus gives us the forgiveness of sins, and is in this very suffering that the King of Glory establishes his reign forever. And we're going to have some of that theme with our next stanza. God's blessings.